We got audio anyway. Good morning. It is still morning, isn't it? Yeah, like 4 minutes worth of morning left. My name's Chris All, in case you hadn't realised by the attire. From a company called Intergen, in case you hadn't realised by the attire. Blog there, Twitter there, feel free to follow me, feel free to jump on the blog. The stuff we're going to look at today, there is some code that you can download and nick off with and use yourself. And I'm going to post that on my blog afterwards. So that's the place to go and hit up in order to get that. So today we're going to talk about how we bolt together SharePoint 2010 and Dynamics CRM. And we're going to talk about SharePoint in terms of both on-premise and in the cloud, but with the CRM stuff, we're primarily going to work in the cloud, right? Because CRM in the cloud is pretty much as capable as CRM on-premise. In terms of a quick survey of the room, how many have done some work with SharePoint? Cool. How many have done some work with CRM? Cool, most people. Awesome. So you'll all know that there are about 1,000,001 different ways that we could stick all this stuff together. We are going to cover but a few. We're going to cover the built-in connection points. This is the native support in both platforms for this type of integration. That's probably a bit richer in CRM than SharePoint. We're going to talk about the business connectivity services, previously known as the Business Data Connector in previous incarnations of SharePoint, and how we can use BCS to connect SharePoint into CRM. I'm going to show you a piece of code. So one of the things we do at Intergen is we write quite a lot of sample applications to Microsoft up in Redmond. And one of the pieces of code I'll show you there is a piece of BCS adapter technology for connecting SharePoint into CRM. And then we'll talk a bit about how do you connect from SharePoint online to CRM online. And who came to my session last night? Cool, a few people. Who can tell me one of the things that's kind of hard to do from SharePoint online? Connect to anything, right? Who's noticed that? The wee sandbox that says, oh yeah, well you're online and our sandbox code won't let you connect to anything. So we'll show you a workaround we have there, which is basically a Silverlight-based workaround. Again, a piece of sample code we wrote for Microsoft that's freely available for you to download and play with yourself that shows you how you can effectively consume this from SharePoint. We do still, unfortunately, have to have a piece of proxy code in the middle, and I'll explain why that is in a little while. So, lots of opportunities when it comes to working with both SharePoint and CRM. Where can we extend beyond what we're going to show you today? So we can extend the application experience. So potentially we could look at using SharePoint to front-end our application, right? Maybe we could use a SharePoint for Internet site, WCM site, to actually front-end some of this data. We might use SharePoint for document processing. So you might use Word services in SharePoint, actually communicate from CRM out to Word services, do some data munging, some document gen, stored in a SharePoint document library. We might use other types of line of business integration, maybe use SharePoint with the BCS as a line of business broker effectively. So we'd use BCS to connect to all of our LOB systems, and then we could connect, say, CRM to the SharePoint web services and consume all of those third-party LOB systems in a common format by consuming them as SharePoint web services. It's a projector remote. Human workflow, right? So potentially using some of the lighter weight human workflow that we can get in SharePoint, reporting and analytics, maybe using some of the performance point stuff and things like that out of SharePoint to do additional rich analytics. And again, I'm sure many of you have seen these sorts of things. Intranet and internet sites, again, surfacing CRM data, surfacing SharePoint data across those sites. We ain't going to talk about any of those today, but there's a whole lot more that you can look at beyond what we're going to talk about. So if we think about the SharePoint developer platform, it has a pretty rich developer platform, right? We now have native tooling support in Visual Studio 2010. So no more using VisiWiz and no more using all those sort of ragtag third-party tools. You can just pick up Visual Studio 2010, go new Visual Web Part, and off you go and rock into writing your web part. And we'll have a look at writing a web part in a bit. Lots of ways to consume SharePoint as a platform service. So it's got RESTful endpoints. We can consume it using link queries. It's got a very rich client object model that we can use from both JavaScript and Silverlight, and some improvements around workflow. And then we've got far more flexible deployment with SharePoint now, in that we have the SharePoint sandbox, and that does allow us to deploy custom code into SharePoint Online. Right, now, we can have a discussion about the limitations of that sandbox and the challenge it presents, but we can actually deploy custom code now into SharePoint Online. CRM was sort of written slightly after SharePoint, so the CRM guys took a dependency on .NET 4. Right? SharePoint is written on 3.5. Right? So they picked up .NET 4, they picked up Workflow Foundation 4. They've done a lot of work around a thing called solution packaging, so it's far easier to pick up the customizations you make to CRM and move them around in a packaged format, a little bit like a WSP on steroids. Better support for strong typing and link querying. That's the XRM Metal stuff that Microsoft licensed from ADX Studio. Rich platform services, this has always been a strong suit for CRM, so the ability to have CRM represent your data model and then consume that data model out of the CRM web services. We can now do that using a native WCF provider, which is a whole lot faster than what it used to be, which is good. It's still not super fast, which is bad. We've got a RESTful endpoint, so we can consume that via a RESTful query, bringing back either Atom or JSON. So that's particularly useful if you're writing little widgets to drop into CRM. You can consume back Atom, JSON with jQuery and so forth. And then that endpoint also supports OData querying, right? So you can use any OData compliant client to query into that. There's some native integration with SharePoint we'll have a look at. There's some Office integration in terms of being able to work with Outlook. Claims-based auth, won't go into that in any detail. And then the cloud offering. So the cloud offering with CRM Online is almost full parity with CRM on-premise. There are a few little limitations around the sandbox in terms of what it prevents you from doing with your sandbox plugin code. There's no ability to run custom workflow activities, but beyond that, you can pretty much do everything. You don't make a lot of sacrifices to deploy your application in CRM Online, and indeed, for any of my customers, my opinion is that the default choice should be CRM Online, and then we should be coming up with reasons why we shouldn't be going that way. It's economical and it's very effective. So, one of the questions I often get asked is, should we build this system in SharePoint or CRM? Who gets those questions? Lots of people, right? And they are quite different beasts. So let's have a look at some of those differences. CRM is very much about structured data. All right? It is, under the hood, a relational database management system with a draggy, droppy, clicky, clicky editor on the top that lets you build your database. It's kind of like Microsoft Access for the web, but every time I say that, someone kicks me in the pants. But I like Microsoft Access. Who likes Microsoft Access? Right? Whose company was founded on the back of Microsoft Access? Right? Back in the 90s. Right? Whereas SharePoint is more structured, semi-structured data. You would not want to build a database in SharePoint lists. Who has seen people build databases in SharePoint lists? Right. Yeah, you don't want to do that. So SharePoint's more about that sort of ad hoc collaboration, really social type engagement. CRM is probably more structured in terms of its structured workloads, structured tasks, activities that you perform, mark off, check off, and so forth. So probably more prescriptive in the way that it sets out a user's workflow. Probably more sort of oriented towards back office type staff as opposed to the more information worker oriented SharePoint. Right? SharePoint really about building up data over time. So we might evolve documents over time. CRM, more about that sort of core information generation you get with the relational database management system. As I said before, in terms of workflows and process flows, SharePoint far more informal and really a supporting system to everyday office-type communications, personal interactions, whereas CRM is very much with workflows around structured and formalized processes. Right? You'll build workflows that really formalize the steps that you go through inside your business. With SharePoint, we are really focused around this idea of enterprise search and touching many, many data sets out through the organization. With CRM, we're really just querying and filtering that content inside the CRM system. Your SharePoint site will typically be a organization-wide asset. Right? Whereas with CRM, we'll often find that if a customer has CRM installed, they may have multiple CRM tenancies, and each of those are effectively a separate piece of application. Right? So it is far more siloed, to be honest, if you're going out with CRM. So, with that in mind, let's look at some of the out-of-the-box integration. So one of the things we get with CRM 2011 is native support for SharePoint document libraries. Plenty of people back and forth would have done this themselves, right? You've written iframes, your iframes go and wrap SharePoint document libraries. This basically does it out of the box for us. So let's start by having a look at that. And I'm cheating a little here in that I'm using, for my SharePoint site, a thing called spsites.microsoft.com, which is an internal instance of a future release of SharePoint Online. It means I can use the nice, sexy-looking SharePoint list component rather than just wrapping a SharePoint list in an iframe. So if we jump into CRM, and so this is CRM Online, and we have a look at my activities and maybe open up a store. So what we'll look at first is how are these document libraries surfaced within SharePoint. And if we dive in here and have a look at the documents section, that document section is surfacing that native SharePoint support. And all things going to plan. It's going to load me right, so this is actually an iframe. Right? Under the hood, this is an iframe, and under the hood, all of the content within this iframe is actually being served up by SharePoint. What we've done is we've installed a component into SharePoint that renders SharePoint lists as though they look like CRM. Right? And so in here we can do things like, create new documents. We can perform many of the actions that you'd expect to perform in SharePoint. Check out, check in, bloody, bloody, blah. So if you're familiar with SharePoint, you go, that looks just like SharePoint, only it looks like CRM. All right? We can do things like maybe add a file. Hopefully. So if we grab a picture. Probably a really big picture. Right, so we can add that file. Again, that's just been added into our SharePoint list. We can see that it is actually a SharePoint list. We can dive in and open SharePoint. And you'll see there is my SharePoint list over in a customized SharePoint instance. So it's a piece of cake to set this stuff up. If we jump into settings, we've got a new setting under System called Document Management. And we have to do a couple of things. The first is we have to install that list component into our SharePoint site. So to do that, jump in there, go install list component. It's going to trot you off to Microsoft.com to download a WSP. That WSP is a sandbox solution that you can install into your on-premise SharePoint server. You cannot currently install it into SharePoint Online. It's not quite supported yet, coming later this year. I'm lucky in that I have that test instance to play with. Right, so you'd install that WSP, and then you'd go through and configure your document management settings. And basically what this does is it determines which entities are going to surface that documents section, and then how are we going to structure those folders. So what's going to be the base URL for all of our folders? And do we want, effectively, the base URL whack a folder for each of the entities, or do we want to structure it in some other sort of hierarchy? So, for example, do we want to effectively have a folder per account, and then within that, a folder per opportunity per account? So we effectively go SharePoint site, whack, accounts, account name, and drill down. And so effectively what we'd do is we'd say, build me a hierarchy that effectively is centered around account. All right, so you end up with account name, whack entity name, whack record name. Does that make sense to people? and it's going to puke at me because they're already created. But that's basically the step you go through. It takes 2 or 3 minutes, and you're up and running. Any questions on that? All good? Who's done that already? A few people. Great. Okay, the next thing is being able to work with SharePoint and actually use those SharePoint developer tools to write out some custom parts that we can drop into SharePoint. Pretty easy to do. We've now got that native support inside Visual Studio for writing all the various code and non-code related customizations that we do for SharePoint. So, what are our major challenges here? Is this a myth or a fact? It's a myth. Why is it a myth? Because they talk to each other using web services. Exactly. Ain't no in-process communication going on here. Right? Yep, it's simply talking to a web service. So what we'll do now is let's jump in and actually build out a basic web part that surfaces CRM data into SharePoint. Now, is this going to work in online? SharePoint Online? No. All right, for a whole bunch of reasons. The first is my web part's going to use parts of the SharePoint object model that I'm not allowed to use in a sandbox solution. And the other is it's going to try and call to CRM, and we can't do that. So this is going to be a demo in my on-premise SharePoint server, otherwise known as my Dell laptop. Again, the tooling's nice and simple here. We're going to go File, New, Project. If I can click that link. Right, we just go in here, SharePoint, New Visual Web Part, and that's actually going to spin up the tooling for us and help us to build our web part. Now, given that we've got a 60-minute session, given I've got 4 big demos to do, I have had the luxury of doing as Alison Holst does and popping one in the oven earlier. All right? So I've grabbed some code, and this code is really, really simple, folks. So we'll start down at the bottom, and I've got a section called Supporting Methods. These are basically things for doing authentication into CRM and for getting a proxy to connect to the CRM web services. That section, you can grab out of my code that I'll post on the blog later, and you can just copy that across your stuff. All right? And then all we're doing in the web part is we're just adding some literal controls. So we're going to write out what's the ID of the user we're connecting as, and then write out each of the account names in our web part. I am a developer. That means this thing looks like it's been beaten by the ugly stick. All right? So if we got a breakpoint set there, what's one of the other nice things about SharePoint 2011 and the Visual Studio support? I can press F5, and what does it do? It just works, right? So it's going to... That's not so good. What a load of bollocks. How do I get rid of that region? That looks better. So it's going to build that up. It's going to package it. It's going to deploy it into SharePoint. It's going to start it up. It's going to attach the debugger, and hopefully it'll hit my breakpoint. Still not super fast, right? So you'll see down here it was doing things like adding my solution, activating that feature. Now it's got to load up IE, hit the site, attach the debugger. So the nice thing about this approach is it's quick and easy to do. The downside, obviously, is it doesn't work with SharePoint Online. Who has 16 gigs of RAM in their laptop? Not me. You have? Yeah, I've got to do that soon. But it means a new laptop. I got an SSD, not in this one, in this one. It's just painful. I mean, you start doing stuff where you're running CRM 2011 plus SharePoint, plus, I don't know, Link, maybe Exchange all on the same machine. It gets very, very painful. So my apologies for the speed problems in starting up. You'll see over here it is actually loading all of the assemblies, so it's doing something. There we go. Alrighty, so we can step through this. We're just going to write out some literal controls. The first thing we do is we're going to authenticate against CRM. So we do that authentication, we get back a token, we're going to pass that token through as we start to make those calls. Again, all this code is pre-written for you, so you're going to be able to pick that up and run with it by downloading it from my blog after this. That's not so good, we've got no bloody internet access. Correct. Yeah, this is code for calling CRM online, but it's not going to work if I can't see the internet. And I ain't going to muck around and set that up right now. You will be able to grab this code. It will work, right, if you have an internet connection. You should be able to pick it up, press F5, and the world will be a better place. It's going to go through, you're going to get your token, you're going to call your web services, be able to query various items out. We're going to pull back a list of accounts from CRM and then write those accounts out for each one, add a new literal control and a line break. But again, no internet access means ain't going to work for me here, unfortunately. Okay, other ways for doing it. So obviously you can go and write that yourself. There's also a thing called the list part, right? And that's from the previous version of SharePoint and target at the previous version of CRM. But the nice thing about Microsoft is they get this concept called backwards compatibility, which is actually kind of good because it means that the same web part is going to work in SharePoint 2010 on premises only. And that will work to connect to CRM online. CRM on-premise. Okay, next thing to talk about is a thing called BCS, Business Connectivity Services. And Business Connectivity Services is all about allowing us to surface third-party application data into SharePoint and work with it as though it's SharePoint data. So basically have it appear to us for the most part as though it's just a standard SharePoint list. Who's done some work with BCS before? 4 or 5, quite a few people. That's good. Can I just quickly ask sort of a quick show what data sources you were working with? SQL? SQL CRM? Yep. Any others? Anything esoteric? No. Say again? Right. Anyone written their own BCS adapter? No. Okay. So, the way BCS works is we have this idea of an external data source. We define what's called an external content type. That external content type effectively specifies the structure, the metadata for that external data source. And there are a bunch of out-of-the-box adapters that we can use, the web services, databases, and so forth. And then you also have the option of writing your own BCS connector. And in our case, we have written our own BCS connector for CRM. Once we have that external content type, BCS can use that connector and it can run not only in SharePoint, right, so in the online environment, but also down in a variety of the Office clients. So Outlook, Word, InfoPath can all work with that BCS connector you've written, the external content type you've defined, to consume that data locally. Right, so in the case of things like Word, it's actually using it natively. There's obviously also the ability to use BCS here in SharePoint and then connect that SharePoint list back down into SharePoint workspaces. So that's a slightly different pattern to actually natively using BCS in the Office application. Anyone use BCS inside an Office application? Written Office extensibility? No. Okay, so how have we built this BCS connector? So there's a couple of ways that we could have approached this. The first is we could actually have just gone and thunked down into the database. Right? I mean, the nice thing about CRM at the end of the day is it maps down into a reasonably simple to understand relational database model. We chose not to take that approach because obviously you can't do that with CRM Online. Don't get to see the database. So instead we used web services. And what we've done is we've written a BCS connector that understands how to talk to CRM Online. And then we've written a tool that can consume the CRM metadata service to effectively create your content type definition. Right. At consumption time, we do require that there is a local WCF proxy. So we have a proxy that we use to manage some of those connections. And the documentation will set out why we did that, but we just had some challenges with passing through the authentication and consuming the CRM services directly out of our BCS connector. So let's have a look at this working. And so to do this, I'm actually remoting into one of my boxes that sits under a desk in Redmond, as you do. So if the internet goes down, we're a bit hosed. Let me just grab my little script here. So let's have a look at it running for a start. So if we jump into SharePoint, what I've got here is just a simple SharePoint site, intranet.contoso.com. I've got a bunch of lists, and this My Accounts list is an external list. So it's an external list that is using our CRM BCS connector to connect through to a CRM Online instance. Because it's a list, I can do all of those things like filtering and sorting, so I can flip around, filter, sort, blah-de-blah-de-blah, as though it's any other SharePoint list. Now, there are a bunch of restrictions on external lists, right? So don't pretend that you're going to be able to suddenly do everything. There are a bunch of restrictions that will prevent you from doing things like alerts and so forth. But for the most part, we can think of this as being just like any other SharePoint list. We have both read and write support here, right? So one of the nice things about BCS versus BDC, which was the previous incarnation, is BCS is now read-write capable. So we can both read the data, but we can also jump in here, right? So we can read, we can also jump in and edit that data. Foo bar, we'll just call it a store named Foo, right? It also supports lookup fields, right? So we can actually choose to look up another piece of external data and actually traverse across that relationship. So relationships are supported in BCS, and when we generate your model for you, we actually emit those relationships based on our interrogation of the CRM metadata service. So we'll change it to George Sullivan. Hit save on that. And if we jump over to my accounts list in CRM Online, we should see that I now have a store called Foo that is owned by George Sullivan. If I jump back to here and hit refresh, you'll see where it's still got a store called Foobar. The reason for this is we do quite aggressive caching. The reason we do quite aggressive caching is because if you start running searches and things across this and you're not caching the data aggressively, all of those search queries need to go out and hit that remote endpoint. And that becomes very painful perf-wise. So the caching is very configurable. You can choose whether you want to turn it off, whether you want to keep it on. That decision is largely going to be determined by how you want to use that data. If you do want to use it really as a pure read-write way of surfacing that data in SharePoint, then you probably want to turn caching off. If what you're interested in is more a read-only, and particularly a way to search CRM data using the enterprise search in SharePoint, then you absolutely want to leave it on. So let's jump in and have a look at the code. And I don't have Zoom It installed on here, unfortunately. So if we look at this, the first thing to note is that we have this CRM entity service web. So we have a proxy web application that we need to run on a separate port on our SharePoint server. Remember, this is BCS. It's only supported in SharePoint on-premise, not supported in SharePoint Online. Right, so we do require that you run that proxy service. We then have our connector code. Right? So if you want really a reference example of how to build a BCS connector, this one should do you a pretty good job of getting started. And again, all of this code is free for you to just grab and run with. Right? And then we have a thing called the CRM BCS util. Who wants to have a guess what that does? It generates something, but it's not code. Right? What's one of the things we have when we use business connectivity services? BCDMs, right? The model. Exactly. We have the model. So we need to generate the model. Right? Now we've actually got a good starting point for generating that model. And what is that? Given we talk CRM, and why is that? CRM has a metadata service that we can query and interrogate. But there are a few caveats there. You probably don't want, if you go and say, I want the account entity, you probably don't want every single field in the account entity because there's a lot of them and you're going to take a pretty big perf hit to pull them back. So we provide the CRM BCS util, and that takes an XML file, and the XML file basically passes in some information about how it's going to access the particular CRM server we're talking to, and then which entities we want to pull through and which attributes we want to pull through. So we define the entity, provide the name, provide its logical name. We provide each of the attributes, and we just provide the name there. Right? So we provide the name, and then at runtime, when you run CRM BCS util, we go off and find all the information about that attribute. You know, what data type is it? What are some of the constraints and restrictions that have been placed on it? And so we provide this sample file. It's got a few dummy attributes that should throw an error. So if I then jump in and actually run that, right, so if I just run it straight off, it's going to ask me to punch in some parameters, and that's probably, you know, all the documentation you should need to run with this thing. I've actually built a batch file that does it. So if I pick up that batch file and run it, and I've got it turned on in info mode, so it's going to spit out a whole bunch of info as it goes through and generates all of that content. So you'll see there are those warnings for the attributes that didn't actually exist. So it's going through, calling the metadata service, pulling back all that information, and it's now generated out.bdcm, right, which is my BDC model. If I drop that into there and just show the XML editor, so you'll see it's taken my reasonably concise input model definition, and it's output a fairly verbose BDCM model. You obviously would not want to be writing this yourself. Anybody want to write that themselves? No. People pretty happy that they could write that themselves? Yes. People pretty happy that they could knock together a quick WPF application that queried the metadata service and basically let you check boxes as to which attributes and entities you wanted? Yes. Right? So, piece of cake. Then in terms of actually using this, so what you'd do is you'd take your BDCM, you'd jump into central admin, come in here to app management, manage your service applications, and jump into business data connectivity services. And what you'd do is you'd go import, browse, and import that model. All right? And that'll import these various entities so that we can then consume them. And what you then do is you create your external list. So if we head back over to SharePoint, view lists, and go create, we can create a list. That's an external list. Something like my TechEd demo list. We choose our external content type, so we'll just pull an account, hit create, and that list will now appear over here as my TechEd demo list with, again, all of those properties that we saw from BCS. Who thinks that's pretty neat? Who thinks it's going to be a useful piece of code to grab? Who's grabbed it and played with it already? Right, Brett. Oh, I have too, but I kind of don't count. Right, so I'm going to chuck that up on my blog a bit later on, and you can grab that and run with it. As I said, this is not hard stuff for you to implement now that we've done all the sort of the heavy lifting work to get full bi-directional integration between SharePoint on-premise and CRM on-premise, CRM online. Alrighty, and then we come to the really hard one. And the really hard one is that what if we've got SharePoint online and we want to connect it to CRM online? If you came to my session last night, you'd realise that that's a pretty hard proposition, right? Because we can't talk outbound from SharePoint, so I couldn't just grab that visual web part that I showed you earlier and throw that up into SharePoint Online. Ain't going to work. So the approach that we came up with was actually, let's do it all client-side, right? Let's basically put some Silverlight down on the client and have that Silverlight communicate over to CRM Online. And we ran into a bit of a roadblock. And if you came to my session last night, you'd know what that roadblock is. Who might want to guess what that roadblock is if I've got my Silverlight component coming down from SharePoint, I want to go and talk to CRM Online? Cross-domain, right? What's the problem with CRM Online? Doesn't have a client access policy to an XML file. So as soon as my Silverlight component down on my client machine says, I want to go and talk to CRM Online, what's the first thing it does? It says, give me whack client access policy.xml. Can't find it, what does it do? It says, I'm not going to talk to this machine. So again, what we've had to do is we've had to put a Windows Azure proxy in the middle. We've built that proxy so it is a super uber duper transparent proxy. All it does is it will pass your request, your web service request through to a list of permitted endpoints, and it will inject a client access policy file at the same time. Right? So it's super duper simple. The goal being to hopefully rip it out later on once we start seeing a proper client access policy up on CRM Online. Please go and ask the team to do that. Send them email. Who can we email? Mark's sending email. Hamish. Hamish will go and ask Hamish afterwards who we should email. Thanks, mate. Yeah, there we go. My email is going to be up at the end. I know all the guys in the team pretty well, so email me, and I will sort of aggregate and forward on. So, what we built is a Silverlight web part that connects Office 365 SharePoint Online to CRM Online. And not content with being sort of simple about it, we kind of added some fancy stuff. So we'll have a look at what that fancy stuff is. So this is SharePoint Online. This is proper SharePoint Online. Right? You can see it's something.sharepoint.com. And in this I have a web part, and I'll just see if it's logged me out. Hopefully it has logged me out, and it'll force me to log back in. No. So I have already authenticated. I authenticated in using my Live ID credentials. Right? And we've basically used those to obtain a token, and then we've cached that token. So what the Silverlight component does is it makes these various web service calls through the proxy. It retrieves all of the metadata about the entity that I want to show. Right, so in this case, it's the account entity. It pulls back all the views, so I can choose which views I want to see. So that's kind of nice. So it does feel a lot like working with CRM. It supports read-write, although we didn't do lookups, so just take that caveat. So we might change that back to a store called foobar. All right, and you'll see we've now got a store called foobar. One of the cool things we did is we actually also did visualizations. All right, so who's familiar with charting in CRM? All right, charts in CRM are defined using a piece of XML. That XML is basically a bastardized XOML notation. It's effectively saying, here's the ASP.NET chart component. Let's take the properties that we've set on that, turn it into XML, store that XML, and we'll use that to help us render it in CRM. You can edit that XML. So what we did is we actually took that XML, and the object model is largely the same as the object model for the for the Silverlight charting components. So we wrote some code that interprets that XML inside Silverlight and tries to render an equivalent chart using the Silverlight charting controls. We don't support all the chart types at the moment. The list of what we do support is in the README, so I don't think we support the funnel and a few things like that, but we support basic bars, lines, and so forth. We don't support custom XML, so we only support XML that you'd write using the Visual Designer inside CRM. But all the same, it's a pretty cool sort of technology demonstration to show that actually we can take that XML and we can reinterpret and re-render it. Because if you think you could potentially also take that XML and maybe re-render it by doing a mapping between that and, say, an HTML5 charting library. And again, we talked a bit about that at the session yesterday. If I have a look at what this looks like in terms of the properties, so if I jump in and have a look at the properties for this web part, you'll see we have some custom properties defined for CRM Silverlight. And I'll just zoom in there. We do support web part connections, right? We have a concept of a main control, and the main control is the one that always surfaces the authentication. Right? So you authenticate in the main control, and all the other controls wait until that main control has authenticated before they try and show their content. What you'll do is you'll specify the CRM org name you want to work with and the CRM server host name. In this case, we're working with CRM Online. The entity you want to bind it to, and the URL for your message router. Right. So the message router in this case is hosted at crmmessagerouter.cloudapp.net/router. That's running in my Azure account, and I'm very beneficent and generous, and I'm happy for you to use that a little bit as you play with this. I.e., you don't need an Azure account, you can go and use the router that's hosted at my place. All right? So that means you can do this all in the cloud because I'm paying for the little bit of the cloud that you might not want to have to pay for. Then the last thing is we can take a themex file. So who knows about what a themex file is and where we edit it in SharePoint 2011? So with SharePoint 2011, they picked up the concept of themes in SharePoint, and they kind of pared them back massively and turned them into really just a sort of set of colors and fonts that you edit using PowerPoint of all things. But what we did is we actually picked up another sample application we wrote for Microsoft last year that will take a themex file and actually use that to apply branding to all of the Silverlight toolkit controls. So the Silverlight toolkit controls have a concept of theming. We wrote some sample code that picks up a SharePoint themex file and effectively creates a custom theme for the Silverlight controls. What does that mean to you? I.e., why the hell should I care? Right? It means that if you use a themex file to theme your SharePoint site, and you write your Silverlight controls, components, just using the Silverlight control toolkit and the out-of-the-box Silverlight controls in Visual Studio, you can include our piece of sample code, and a good example of how to use it is this application. Point your application at your themex file, and it will automatically recolor your Silverlight controls to match the rest of your site. Who thinks that's kind of cool? Yeah, it's kind of cool. It's a little bit of, just fun sample code. So let's actually have a look at some of the code. And again, I'm not going to go into this in a whole lot of detail. All right, so the first important thing is we've got this, this message router web, right? So we've got the message router Windows Azure project that we need to deploy into Windows Azure. Again, I have beneficently done that for you. That means that it will work for CRM Online. And the reason it will work for CRM Online is that I've said that the router will allow you to communicate through to the host star.dynamics.com, login.live.com, and nexus.passport.com. All right, and that'll be up there at least for the foreseeable future. If you have any problems using it, just ping me an email or grab me on Twitter. Again, if you're going to use it for a production system, I'd say I'd rather you didn't, just because I do still have to pay some of the traffic charges. But for the most part, for playing around, please do go and use that. It'll save you running up your own Azure account. All right, so we host that up in Windows Azure. Then we have our web part, and that's pretty simple. It's just wrapping up our Silverlight. And our Silverlight client is made up of 2 bits. We've got the Silverlight client itself, and that's all of the logic that we use for calling the services and effectively returning those as a model that can be consumed by our visualizer. And then our visualizer has all of the stuff that we use for rendering the grid and the chart on the page. And again, we make full use of the Silverlight Control Toolkit controls, and by doing that, we can use the MSUS Silverlight Themex control that will apply that Themex file to the rest of your Silverlight Toolkit controls. So again, not a lot of that's a screenshot of it. I couldn't get it working this morning, so I had to go and redeploy the router. We didn't do a lot of super deep technical coding in there, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff that I really just wanted to show you. This exists, this exists, this exists. Go and grab it. It is pretty easy to get this stuff working. It's even easier now that we've sort of written some of these basic building blocks for you. The native SharePoint integration in CRM is pretty decent, right? So it solves the vast majority of scenarios that we've previously had to hack together ourselves with iframes. There is still some advanced stuff you may want to do. If you're going to start doing document generation and so forth, you've got to decide how do you do that. Probably my preferred approach at the moment is to do that document generation emitting OpenXML inside a CRM Sandbox plugin, and then use the SharePoint object library to copy that document into SharePoint. Right? Because that's going to work with SharePoint Online. If you have the luxury of a SharePoint on-premise system, then you may actually want to hand that context off to SharePoint on-premise. What's a great way to hand that context off? Service bus. So maybe using native service bus integration. Hand the context off to your SharePoint server, and then you can use Word Services to do that. And Word Services is kind of a bit nicer for generating documents than raw OpenXML, because you can do things like refresh tables of contents and so forth. So you can do this stuff all in the cloud though, right? I mean, we've shown a bunch of ways that you can do the whole lot in the cloud. And I think for many, many customers, that's an appropriate sort of set of technologies to choose when building out new applications. With that, I will throw up some resources. So some stuff that you will find useful. The CRM 2011 Developer Training Kit has sort of evolved. Again, my team and I built that along with a guy called David Yak out of Colorado. In fact, Rex, you would have been involved in building some of that. So you can download that from Microsoft.com, and that's basically a how-to developer guide for CRM 2011. Doesn't assume too much prior knowledge. The SharePoint 2010 Developer Training Kit, very similar, and we had some involvement in that. And then the Windows Azure plus SharePoint Training Kit, and we had some involvement building that too. Then with the Developer Training Kit for CRM, there are a whole lot of PowerPoint presentations, so we've recorded those PowerPoint presentations and put them up on Channel 9. So if you're happy to see more of me bleating on, You can go and watch about 16 hours of video of myself and Dave wisecracking and talking through those slides. There's also the Office 365 developer training kit up there as well. And then finally, my blog is worth following. Girish Raj's blog is worth following. So Girish is the guy who commissioned us to write a lot of these pieces of sample code. And again, I will put the BCS connector and Silverlight Webpack code up on my blog. It is completely unsupported by Microsoft. It is completely unsupported by Intergen unless you call us up and decide to get us to come and help you work with it. But no warranties, disclaimers. If it fries your cat, not my fault. But otherwise, it's free for you to use. So it's really public domain licensed. Off you go, knock yourself out. With that, I'll encourage you to fill out your evals. Oh, come to the SharePoint conference. Who's going to the SharePoint conference? A couple of people. It's going to be awesome. So I look forward to seeing you there at the parties and at my sessions. Fill out your evals. Always appreciate evals. Always appreciate comments too, particularly if you're a 5 or a 1. Really appreciate comments, particularly if you're a 1. With that, I'll take questions.